Sparks, and she preaches at a church on Madison Avenue in New York City. She's also an excellent and funny author and lecturer on humor in our faith. The first time I heard Reverend Sparks speak was in Nashville at a preaching convention, and she told a funny story to a crowd of pastors about leading the Lord's Prayer in church and forgetting the words. It's what theater folk call going up on their lines. And in fairness to Reverend Sparks, leading the Lord's Prayer is a different dynamic than reciting it, and it can be embarrassing, but it's pretty easy to lose track of words up here in a leadership role. Reverend Sparks and I became friends after I read her wonderful book, Laugh Your Way to Grace, Proclaiming the Spiritual Power of Humor. I sent her a note telling her how much I enjoyed that book and that she was not alone being a pastor with a background in law and entertainment. And I also mentioned that I had heard her lecture on going up on her lines in the Lord's Prayer and that I had done it myself. A number of years ago, I got a call at 2 in the morning to come over and administer the last rites to a member in her home. It was and always is touching and a very powerful ceremony. But I often wonder what the nurses' aides thought of this pastor in the stall with a dynamic ceremony at 2 in the morning who closed, stumbling his way through the Lord's Prayer, the only part that they knew. Until now, Reverend Sparks and Nancy are the only two people that have heard that story, and only Reverend Sparks only she knew until now that, like her, I keep the words of the Lord's Prayer up on the pulpit on Sundays, just in case. It's always here. Today's reading is Luke's version of that beautiful prayer that Jesus taught us. Luke records that he was praying in a certain place, and after he had finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray as John taught his disciples." And he said to them, "When you pray, say, Father, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins, for we ourselves forgive everyone indebted to us. And do not bring us to the time of trial." We say the Lord's Prayer so often in church that I'm sure most of us heard it echoing in the reading when Dick read it, but it's also become kind of mantra-like, maybe even rote. So I'm going to read the Lord's Prayer to emphasize it again, to go along and discuss the reading that we had. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Well, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, and deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever have been added. But the heart of that prayer we say every week is virtually the same one from Luke. It echoes Luke. And Luke's version is considered by scholars to echo the earliest written version. There were certainly early unwritten versions, what Jesus said and then what people said Jesus said. Because, see, the prayer first traveled as an oral tradition about Jesus. His followers told stories and recollections about him and passed on his parables and wisdom sayings and, among other things, this prayer. It appears that for a quarter of a century or so, word of mouth was actually the only means by which the Jesus tradition existed, was transmitted. Back then, when you heard someone tell you about Jesus, back then, you heard someone tell you about Jesus, or you told someone about Jesus. No Facebook, no Twitter, no email, no fancy cell phones. It went from mouth to ear and from ears to mouths for a good number of years, because reading at that time and in that place was only for a very few. Writing was for even fewer. Paper and ink and books cost a lot of money, so not just anything got put into writing. It had to be important to those who read, wrote, and could afford ink, paper, and books. In other words, it is very unlikely a poor itinerant backwoods rabbi or his disciples or his first followers read or wrote or had books. Paul's letter from the 6th and the 7th decade of the 1st century are the oldest Christian writings that we now have. Before that, during Jesus' life and for a number of years afterwards, we're pretty sure that there were no writings to speak of. What they had were dynamic oral tellings and retellings until, as Professor Stephen Patterson puts it, someone happened to join with the followers of Jesus who could write, who had the wherewithal to purchase the necessary material, and who had the time to devote to the actual production of that text. Gospels, it turns out, were a luxury that almost no one could afford. As I mentioned, it's thought that the oldest written version of the Lord's Prayer is echoing in Luke, only it's not originally a writing from Luke. The author of Luke appears to have had a copy of a now lost sayings gospel and quoted that gospel in his gospel. Obviously, we don't directly have either the oral tradition I've been talking about or this lost gospel sourcing. We don't even know the lost gospel's name. We call it Q, which is an abbreviation of the German word for source, Quell. And we know Q exists because Matthew and Luke have stories so similar in written style and form that they evidence a secondary source, Q. It's a similar use of probability evidence that we may have heard this week about using another's words, a written speech. The wording in Matthew and Luke, too much alike to not be attributed to another source, to Q. The oral tradition has long been lost, but Q is a record, ink on paper, capturing the oral tradition from around the 7th decade, which Luke later read, copied, and preserved for us as a sort of frozen picture of the Word, which is great. I mean, thank goodness we have them. But they are words that we cannot fully understand unless we have a feeling for the context in which they were spoken and passed on and on and on and finally and thankfully written down. Professor Patterson, in his fascinating book that I highly recommend called The Lost Way, writes that this is how the Lord's Prayer would have appeared in Q. Father, holy be your name. May your empire come. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, for we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into trial. At the time, most people hearing and saying the prayer would have had a real concern for daily bread. Not to dip in soup or make sandwiches in, but to survive. Daily bread was a daily worry. Income was at a subsistent level for the vast majority of people in 1st century Palestine. In Jesus' time, will I eat today was a constant concern, almost always for almost everyone. God, give us this day our daily bread is a prayer for the sustenance to survive, for an answer to the insistent need for nourishment, to live. And thankfully, most of us cannot fathom such an insistent daily need, but it was very, very real to Jesus' followers and the crowds that he spoke to. And notice that Jesus' prayer is not for self alone. It includes others. It's not, God, give me my daily bread. It is, give us our daily bread. This is a prayer that we all be fed, that we all be given our daily bread, which makes sense in light of the part of the prayer that asks for God's kingdom. God's empire, you see, is very different from the Roman Empire. God's empire is a place where the emperor, the king, gives what is needed. All have their daily bread. The emperor cares very much for all the people of the empire. And the part of the prayer for debt forgiveness also needs some context. To go into debt back then, we can imagine, was somewhat like movies portray going into debt to a loan shark or the mafia. It's a scary, threatening, slippery slope. Debt was the first step towards destitution. There's no bankruptcy or other means of forgiveness. Going into debt meant big trouble that could lead to things like loss of property, homelessness, begging, jail, giving your children over as a slave, giving yourself over as a slave. Debt meant almost certain ruin. And often it was for taxes, very often, which also helps us make sense of the part of the prayer that asks for God's kingdom to come. God's empire is not the Roman Empire, where the emperor, the king, takes and takes and takes and takes, and you are in debt and facing ruin, and no one in the system cares. In God's empire, debts are forgiven, and so no trial to confiscate holdings or property and sell them occurs. God, as emperor in the empire of God, cares and forgives debt, and so do God's people. First sayers and hearers of this prayer were not hoping for heaven in the afterlife. The prayer is not about God's kingdom coming way up there, away in some other heavenly realm. The prayer is about heaven on earth, God's way unfolding here in the land of living, changing the widespread, barely living status by eliminating the basic threats to living fully: starvation, debt, and trial lead to destitution. And again, it's a prayer not just for his person, but for all of us. Give us our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. It's about bringing heaven, God's empire, to earth in the world by and for us and others. Christians in the West, by and large, have collectively mostly forgotten that meaning. We've sort of gone up on our lines. We've forgotten how to say them as they were very likely meant to be said, and forgotten how to hear them as they were very likely meant to be heard. It's a prayer originally meant to very reverently ask God to bring us a new empire, God's empire, to ask that everyone be fed and kept out of debt to others and to us, so that there are no debtor trials to deprive anyone of necessities, to drive anyone into destitution. The Lord's Prayer is said all the time, in all sorts of churches, in all sorts of denominations, all around the world. Think about that. Not one word of that prayer is about having or getting a set of approved beliefs. It's not about Jesus coming into our hearts or other hearts in some special prescribed way. It doesn't mention Christ or Jesus or hell. It's not about hate for those who are not like us or retribution for sins of any kind. The prayer Jesus left us is not about the things that religious elite thump Bibles over. It's not about who is right and who is wrong. It's not about a sinner. It's not about who is entitled to some religious elite's false ideas about God excluding some from love or salvation or honor or wealth. The topics that Christians often argue about and get mad over were not important enough in the prayer that Jesus taught to get in it. Not important enough to be in our Christian tradition that instead has had Jesus' followers solemnly utter week in and week out a prayer of universal care, so that all might get enough. You see, whether we know it or not, or like it or not, the prayer Jesus left us, taught us, the one prayer we all sincerely say as Christians, is focused on bringing about an empire with God reigning and making sure I'll have enough to eat each day and stay out of debt and out of debtors' court, so there will be no more destitution, desolation, and devastating poverty for anyone. And from a historical and theological perspective, it's wonderful that it is very likely that the prayer's words are pretty darn near close to Jesus' words that he taught us 2,000 years ago. Words so powerful. Jesus' first followers remembered them and passed them on by word of mouth until they could be preserved and writing and live on and on and on in countless prayers by Jesus' followers ever since. It's a prayer asking that everyone have enough. How simple, how divine, how loving. And what a miracle that we pray it still over and over and over again. May we and all of Christianity pray it until it is answered, until God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven.